very near Walden Pond. We're between Lincoln and Concord, in the heart of the Puritan New England countryside. When we came to this place in 1937, we hadn't imagined that we could build a house in the first year of our residence in this country. But a friend of ours, Mr. Harry Shapley, architect in Boston, asked Mrs. Storrow, who had been so very generous in donating the Storrow Drive and the Memorial Drive to the city of Cambridge, whether she might give Mr. Gropius a chance to build his own house, because they all wanted to see what new thing he might do, and Mrs. Storrow agreed right away. She was quite an old lady at that time, but totally unafraid. She had no idea what modern architecture was like, and she wanted to see it. My husband was always very charmed by the natural curiosity of Americans, which he found was greater than in other countries. Of course, when we built the house, my husband was in partnership with Marcel Breuer, who shortly after this built his own house next to ours. They signed their buildings with both their names at the time, but of course each one did their own house very much for themselves and according to their own tastes and approaches. I think sometimes people think of their interiors as well as their gardens too much as a static picture which they create and then hope it'll stay that way. Garden has a way of changing constantly, so that certain proportions that you've thought of as static change simply because nature can't be conducted in such an authoritative manner. It has its own style, its own way of growing, and you have to make a deal with it. As to the direct environment of the house, we developed that very slowly, trying to make use of the natural features we found here, which combines a garden, a field, a woods, an orchard, and a swamp. In fact, it was our only fatherland because we felt very much like world citizens at the time. But this little spot here was in more than one sense our own. My husband always was torn between the desire to get to the office early in the morning or to dwell, just to be here and see all the interesting and wonderful things that happened around the house. In the late years, this house became his fortress, and when he came home, he wanted to be by himself, to concentrate, to think, to write. It was his very greatest need to be here alone, concentrated in the garden, in nature, completely by himself. That was one of his greatest needs. The spiral staircase in front of the house proved to be a very good feature because the children moved up that staircase and played on the roof deck, didn't bring any dirt in the house, and we were completely undisturbed in our porch on the ground floor. I remember the thousands of people who came in those first years to see this house. I remember one old lady and gentleman who came from New York after the house had been in the New York Times. They came in and they looked over all and everything, and finally the old lady asked me, "Mrs. Gropius, isn't it terribly strenuous to always have to live so much ahead of your time?" That to me was a very strange question, because I had to explain to her that we had lived in a modern house in Germany built in 1925. And to us this was a natural expression of our way of life, which required no extra strain or extra thinking every morning, how could I be ahead of my time? It was a typical expression of the way we lived, and as that, completely natural to us. Miss Gropius is, of course, identified with a functional style. Functional to us is a very different word than it is to most people who think of it as a very narrow, useful, practical approach. It has a lot of psychological overtones which we want to see satisfied just as much. So this house was built for our comfort, our amusement, just as much as any old Victorian house would have been built for such purposes. It fitted our life like a glove. We have kept the house extremely flexible in that way. But the basic features are functioning just as well as they did in the beginning. All the furniture you see in this room is made in 1925 in the Bauhaus workshops. These are all things that we brought over from Germany. My husband was teaching in Harvard, and we made it a point to always ask all the master students out to the house for 2 great parties a year to give them a chance to see a modern house in operation, because they couldn't see it anyplace else except in the Middle West, where houses by Frank Lloyd Wright had been built, or in California, where houses by Mr. Neutra had been built. People said, "Oh, don't you want to write your biography?" He didn't want to, because he felt that the documents of the time are the real thing. He felt that any reminiscing is so conditioned by the later experiences you have had that you are bound to look at things, seeing them in a different light than what you thought and felt and anticipated at the time. Grossman felt that painters and sculptors were the initial link between what he called man and the unknown, the thing that you pull down from heavens to make a new image in this world, and that this initial knowledge, image, comes first to the artist and only then to the scientist and the philosopher. Mumford, at his first visit here in 1939, wrote in our guest book, "Hail to the most indigenous, the most regional example of the New England home, the New England of a new world."